Good, that's better. No, is it making? It is. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I have the responsibility and the task of putting together a very brief statement, a summary of the key emerging issues from our discussions in the last 2 days. As we stated at the beginning, we presented a discussion paper based on a research that we undertook at the African Child Policy Forum. From these discussions, we are going to enrich that discussion paper and come up with a concluded research report. And part of that research report is going to reflect the outcome statements, and this is what I'm going to present to you now. An abbreviated version, because I think I have only 3 minutes or 5. Africa's climate crisis is a crisis of child rights and well-being. We all agree. The rights of almost 500 million children in sub-Saharan Africa are at risk from the worst impacts of climate change, including violence, exploitation, and displacement. This is not a future problem. At least 11 million African children already face the daily reality of not having enough to eat because of extreme weather events, be they droughts or floods. Climate change causes conflicts, destroys children's homes, forces them into migration, and hinders access to protection. The rights of children to life, to health, to education, to security are all in jeopardy, and the list goes on. In some cases, these rights have already disappeared. The development gains that we as a continent have fought hard for and won in recent decades are seriously at risk because of these extreme weather events. Because of rising temperatures, changing rainfall seasons, and crop failures that occur across the continent. All of Africa together accounts for estimated only 3.3% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions from energy and industrial sources. Half of all global emissions are produced by the richest 10% of countries. By 2050, Africa will be home to 1 billion children and young people. With the right life chances, these children could power a continental renaissance, social, cultural, and economic renaissance. But these possibilities are now endangered. The economic impacts of climate change are already, right now, creating a future of poor or low education, of ill health, of unemployment, of deepening poverty, of low productivity, and of negligible economic growth. The same young people who could build a brighter future for the continent could also quite easily become a heavy and productive burden for countries that cannot afford to support them, if we do not act now. The African Child Policy Forum has organized this 9th International Policy Conference and brought together hundreds of child rights experts, government representatives, civil society organizations, young people, academics, UN, African agencies, to look at what countries can do, and especially those who are most vulnerable to climate risks. This meeting was immeasurably enriched, and you will agree with me, by the young activists we've had in the room, who began their work themselves as children from as young as 14 years, from Uganda, Kenya, and Benin. Inspired by these young voices, the discussions of this conference have produced some urgent emerging recommendations, and I propose. The first conclusion and emerging theme is that while children are some of the most vulnerable victims of rights violations driven by climate change, they are and must remain a huge and central part of the solution. This is true not just in the vague sense that they are the future, or even as part of the commitment to realize the right to participation in decision-making, but fundamentally because they are already at the forefront of the African response to climate change. They are some of the loudest and most effective voices, as we have just heard. This is an incredible achievement for our children and our young people, and one that we must acknowledge. We are perhaps too used to talking about children's potential and is insufficiently accustomed to what it looks like when it manifests itself in reality, as we have just seen. Second, a structural, rights-based, legislative, and regulatory response is required. It is increasingly difficult to ignore the transformational impact of climate change on public law and policy in Africa. But despite this, and despite very strong arguments for action based on existing obligations and agreements such as the UNCRC and the African Charter for Children, there is still a broad reluctance to address climate change from the human rights perspective, less so from a child rights or women's rights perspective. Moving on, poverty is at the root of many of the vulnerabilities that result in violations of children's rights, including those related to climate change. Addressing poverty in a piecemeal fashion has not taken us far. This is unlikely to suddenly change. Consideration of universal basic income, a minimum floor of protection for every citizen, family, and child, is a reconfiguration of the responsibility of the state that deserves serious consideration. It could be a highly effective approach based on collective solidarity through which governments could empower people to deal with the worst forms of poverty within their own contexts. Fourth, the conference urgently calls on governments who bear the greatest duty to protect children's rights to ensure that children come first in everything that governments do, whether that be environmental policy, budgetary decisions, or social protection, or other policies. Governments must be pushed to establish national child protection systems that are robust and resilient. Without these, child rights discussions are futile. First things first, effective systems and structures. These are essential and they must be put in place in order to forge forward and protect children's rights. Finances, money, is always a critical sticky point. This conference, in various panels, has made it clear that financing is an urgent need, is an urgent issue that calls for financial investment and economic policies that prevent and respond to the effects of climate change on African children. Governments and funders, including Western funders, also need to address an urgent gap evident in countries across Africa, whereby those ministries and agencies entrusted with children's issues are poorly resourced, under-resourced in terms of human capacity, with only 2, perhaps 3 persons committed to working on children's issues. Strengthening these ministries' capacity is crucial so that they can advocate effectively at government level. And we applaud those governments that have already done this and set aside ministries with the sole responsibility of taking care of children. It has become clear that lengthy and demanding approval processes for international climate financing are also significant barriers. Financial organizations should therefore review and streamline their processes and at the same time help to teach and train the relevant professionals and actors within governments and civil societies in African countries to develop and implement these mitigation and adaptation programs, building their capacity for them to be able to seek finances, access it, and utilize it optimally. In a broader sense, however, the world is in a difficult place. We cannot deny that. The last 3 years have been extremely difficult. Financing has become increasingly difficult to come by. A better understanding of how different issues overlap and cut across one another, and how different portfolios impact climate change and child rights issues allows other funding streams to be leveraged to achieve climate and child rights goals. Climate financing is a very narrow construct. A broader perspective, avoiding silos, means that health projects, business regulations, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, ocean preservations, and all other forms of development can all be used and mainstream and have climate change mainstreamed together with child rights in order to have greater effect. 6, so that we can have more and better informed discussions that lead to real, visible change. More work is needed from researchers and funders of research to expand and substantiate knowledge of climate change's impact on children and their rights. Deeper and better understanding of impact is crucial so we can devise and implement better and effective solutions and advocate strongly for action. Evidence speaks loudest. Finally, another sticky palm, accountability. The conference discussions have stressed the urgency of action and the potential enormous costs of failure. But we need serious, sustainable accountability mechanisms if we are to ensure that we follow up on all our beautiful commitments and promises. Recent cases and rulings around the world support the recommendation that where possible and necessary, climate activists, CSO agents, governments, and other parties should use the courts to enforce action and accountability where it is not willingly offered, and to challenge and put an end to the series of broken promises. In this regard, the presence of so many governments represented at high level by 9 ministers at this international policy conference, and who are working tirelessly for some of the world's most affected children, has been a blessing. Ministers and officials, senior officials in particular, can be held accountable for their commitments here and elsewhere. They can be presented to the world as ambassadors for child rights and climate justice. And so we shall be doing. These honorable ministers, you now have an opportunity to set an example for others, create an invaluable precedent on the lessons learned and mechanisms by which we can hold entire sectors, governments, regions, and groups accountable in the future. Accountability is a question that touches on all of us, not only on our governments. Everywhere in the world, no matter how fortunate or unfortunate our circumstances, and for the simple reason that we are accountable for children in their families and in their communities, in their schools and on their playgrounds. The climate crisis has no respect for borders. A global problem of this nature can only be tackled if we are to tackle it through collective action. International cooperation is essential and inevitable. We share a single, finite, manifestly exhaustible planet. Failure to act morally and strongly in facing this crisis by any individual, organization, or government, here or elsewhere, compromises the chances of continued existence for all of us. There is no other option now than to cooperate with trust and in good faith. Thank you, Excellencies.
Excellences, grâce à ma chère présidente du conseil d'administration internationale de la CPF et fondatrice, américaine présidente du conseil d'administration de l'organisation grâce à ma chère Trust. Excellences, mesdames et messieurs les ministres ici présents, Excellences, mesdames et messieurs les ambassadeurs, distingués délégués des États membres de l'Union africaine ici présents, Dr Najat, représentant spécial du secrétaire général des Nations Unies sur les violences faites aux enfants, chers membres du conseil d'administration de la CPF ici présents, Madame la directrice exécutive de la CPS et de votre équipe, chez l'honorable Théophane, membre du comité africain d'experts sur les droits et le bien-être de l'enfant, chez l'équipe de notre secrétariat ici présent, chez les représentants des enfants, Excellences, honorables distingués participants, Mesdames et Messieurs, tout protocole observé. Au nom du comité africain d'experts sur les droits et le bien-être de l'enfant, et à mon nom propre, permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier les organisateurs de la conférence pour nous avoir permis de participer à cette initiative visant à examiner le changement climatique en tant que catastrophe qui fait reculer les progrès réalisés en matière de droits de l'enfant en Afrique et à inclure l'enfant africain dans le discours sur le changement climatique et à encourager les politiques et les actions dirigeantes. Compte tenu de la gravité de la menace que représente le changement climatique pour la mise en œuvre effective des droits de l'enfant sur le continent, je suis ravi que ce sujet ait été choisi comme thème de la conférence de cette année. Il est évident, suite aux discussions menées avec les États membres et d'autres parties prenantes au cours de ces deux journées, que le changement climatique est la menace la plus grave à laquelle est confrontée la mise en œuvre effective des droits de l'enfant sur le continent et que des efforts accrus doivent être déployés pour faire face à son impact sur les droits et le bien-être des enfants en Afrique. Les changements climatiques se sont également avérés avoir des conséquences transgénérationnelles de grande ampleur pour les générations futures, ainsi que des effets disproportionnés sur les droits et les intérêts des enfants d'aujourd'hui. Il constitue une menace pour la mise en œuvre effective de la plupart, sinon de la totalité des droits consacrés par la Charte africaine des droits et du bien-être de l'enfant, notamment le droit à la vie, à la survie et au développement, ainsi que le droit à l'éducation, à une nutrition adéquate et à la santé. Non seulement il menace la mise en œuvre effective des droits reconnus dans la Charte, il entrave également la réalisation des objectifs continentaux visés par l'agenda 2040, en particulier les aspirations 4 et 9 qui visent respectivement à ce que chaque enfant survive et ait une enfance saine et à ce qu'il soit à l'abri des effets des catastrophes et d'autres situations d'urgence. Excellences, honorables et distingués participants, chers enfants, mesdames et messieurs, au cours de nos discussions, nous avons pu acquérir un aperçu considérable des enjeux actuels et des principaux sujets de préoccupation concernant les enfants dans le contexte du changement climatique. Le comité est particulièrement préoccupé par l'absence d'une approche fondée sur les droits de l'enfant dans les actions climatiques, la faible capacité des pays à s'adapter au changement climatique, le manque de financement destiné au climat, l'absence de données actualisées, fiables et ventilées en rapport avec l'impact du changement climatique sur les droits de l'enfant en Afrique, ainsi que l'absence de recours juridique efficace pour les enfants en cas de préjudice lié au changement climatique, de même que la participation des enfants aux actions climatiques. Le comité est bien placé pour surveiller et conseiller les États sur la manière de protéger les droits des enfants dans le contexte de la crise climatique. Le comité peut y parvenir en recourant aux mécanismes existants, tels que le mécanisme de rapport des États partis, sa procédure de communication, les lettres d'appel urgent et les missions d'établissement des filles. De plus, le comité a créé un groupe de travail sur les droits des enfants et le changement climatique, en reconnaissant les effets dévastateurs du changement climatique sur les enfants du continent. Le groupe de travail est en train de développer une étude continentale sur l'impact du changement climatique, sur les droits et le bien-être des enfants en Afrique, et a déjà publié une résolution sur les droits des enfants et le changement climatique. Excellence, honorable et distingués participants chez les enfants, mesdames et messieurs. La prise en compte de l'impact du changement climatique sur les droits de l'enfant en Afrique nécessite toutefois un effort de collaboration et de synergie de la part de toutes les parties prenantes concernées. Dans cette optique, et sur la base de nos discussions mutuelles déjà menées, le comité invite instamment les États membres et toutes les parties prenantes concernées à primo veiller à ce que les mesures prises pour neutraliser les effets du changement climatique respectent les droits des enfants garantis par la Charte, y compris l'intérêt supérieur de l'enfant. Deuxièmement, mobiliser et allouer des ressources suffisantes, y compris des ressources humaines, pour faire face à l'impact du changement climatique sur les droits de l'enfant. Troisièmement, garantir et renforcer la participation significative des enfants au processus décisionnel pertinent relatif aux politiques et programmes d'adaptation et d'atténuation du climat. Quatrièmement, effectuer des évaluations des réflexions climatiques sur les droits des enfants et élaborer des méthodes de collecte de données précises, normalisées par pied, ainsi que des techniques de collecte de données qui permettent de déterminer avec exactitude les risques climatiques auxquels sont exposés les enfants afin que les politiques puissent y répondre adéquatement. Cinquièmement, mettre en place des mécanismes appropriés pour contrôler la protection et la promotion du défense des droits de l'enfant, tel que consacré par la Charte, la Convention des Nations Unies relative aux droits de l'enfant et d'autres normes internationales pertinentes dans le contexte du changement climatique. Sixièmement, en fait, le comité souhaite souligner le fait que la crise climatique touche différents groupes d'enfants. Les enfants victimes d'illégalité et de discrimination sont les plus touchés. Le comité appelle donc toutes les parties prenantes à tenir dûment compte de ces facteurs de différenciation dans l'élaboration des réponses et des programmes adaptés aux enfants face au changement climatique. Excellence, honorable conseiller participants, chez les enfants, mesdames et messieurs, le comité exhorte également les États membres à travailler en étroite collaboration avec les secteurs concernés au niveau national, continental et international, en particulier les organisations non gouvernementales et les communautés économiques et régionales, afin de veiller à ce que les interventions en matière de changement climatique soient coordonnées et fondées sur les droits de l'enfant. Enfin, je voudrais transmettre l'invitation du comité à tous les États membres et à toutes les parties prenantes et concernées de se joindre à son groupe de travail sur le changement climatique et les droits de l'enfant dans ses efforts.
Young leaders to cover me and to give me a bit of energy to be able to say a few words at the closing of our very successful conference. begin by saying that I believe that all of us learned or became much more aware of the impact of climate change on children. But I have to say that we are far behind in terms of exercising with the responsibility, the accountability which the conference has called for. So impact, yes. Many of us have become, and I want to say to become conscious. It's not to be aware, it's to be conscious of the impact. But I don't think we are close to accept the responsibility of accountability. Let me try to illustrate what I mean. Many of us here are grandparents like me, and I'm looking at a few of those who are grandparents. The majority will be parents, and a few will be young, will be older, brothers or sisters of someone. So all of us, without closing our eyes, we can see what we mean by the African child we are talking about. Either it is our grandchild, or it's our child, or is a younger brother or younger sister. Now, we are being told that this grandchild and this child and this younger sister or younger brother will not be allowed to live the next 5 years. I'm not saying more than that, next 5 years with a healthy environment, and will not be able then to go beyond that age, living a life with dignity. And then of course we heard about hunger, displacement, you name it, all those things which we know are happening. Now my question is, really, if you bring very close to you and you become conscious that this grandchild of mine is left only perhaps with 5 years, but it could be to be told is left only with 1 year, what would you do? What I would do, and what would you do? Could we come at the end of that conscience and making the kind of speeches we are making? And we say, oh yes, legislation, oh yes, institutions, oh yes, budgets. But if we talk, we are completely distant of the human touch of the child I'm talking about. That's why we can afford to make statements which show clearly that we are very far from taking responsibility and become accountable. What I'm trying to say is whatever we have been doing, whatever we have committed here, and my brother, who was moderating the last group, put it very clear. I thought, in fact, that the session should have ended. It was very clear that science is talking in one direction. Politics are moving in a different direction. Activism is still too shy and too timid to shake, okay? To shake the politics, to leave behind, to live at the level of the magnitude and the depth of the problem. Activism is still timid and too small. And of course, finance, finance can come from our own countries, from the developed world, whenever we are absolutely convinced that this is the right thing to do, because I see my child, my grandchild, and my younger sister, and I know I can do something to provide conditions for this child to live long, and of course for the planet to offer opportunity to many and many generations to come. Money can come. And money is not coming from our own government. Money is not coming from developed countries because we are too distant of having that relationship of impact and responsibility. The children we are talking about, African children, they are still numbers for us. They are simply numbers. But I swear to you, if my grandchild is at risk, I will do the impossible to make sure that this grandchild of mine will not miss a life. I will do that. And you also, as parents, you will do that. You also, as all the brothers and sisters, will do that. All of us will shake whatever is necessary to give a chance to those who mean to us, because they are our lives. The problem is that those children we are talking about here are somebody's children. They are blood of somebody else who doesn't talk to us very deep. So I really feel that yes, let's take home the conscience of the impact, but we have to work hard with accountability. Accountability is not close to what it should be. Now, the most important lesson we all are taking is from these three voices. These three voices. They didn't mince their words. And they even talk of somebody's else's responsibility. Each one of them, directly, they have told us they are taking responsibility. But more than taking responsibility, they are leading. They are driving. They are giving the vision of where this continent of ours should be going. They even had the courage to understand that if they stop with the kind of statements which they made to us yesterday, it would have been only one very interesting, or even if you like, important statement by children, and you would say quite proudly, oh, it's the voice. But these three young people have the courage to say at the end, we have to tell these people because they don't seem to have understood. They had the courage to come and say, listen, we are not talking about something you have to do in 5 years. We are talking of an emergency. Did you hear me? Yes. This is what he said. It's an emergency. And it had to come from them to shame all of us, to say, these children understood that we are living in an emergency, and they declared an emergency. I'm standing here, really with the amount of humility I can have, and to say, you know what? You are those who are going to teach us what it means to take responsibility and what it means to be accountable. You are the one. You did it here, and with your brothers and sisters of your generation, this is what you have to tell everyone until the millions of Africans, particularly the adults on this continent, wherever they are, in whatever is the capacity in which they are, you are the ones who are going to tell our millions of Africans that there is a solution for the climate crisis. And you are leading how to solve this crisis. You know, our continent can, and it must, perhaps I should say, an example of how to reverse the crisis. We have it all. We have you. Yes, we also have the resources. Yes, even in terms of landscape. Yes, we have drought here, we have floods there. But generally speaking, our continent still has the resources and the capacity of being an example as part of the planet, a healthy planet. We can do that. And I just want to thank you. So thank you. So don't miss, as you didn't hear. Don't miss your words. Don't be even too polite whenever it's necessary. Because we don't seem to have the courage you have. And because you have that courage, take leadership. Take leadership. And knowing that you are, it's not like you can be, you are the solution for Africa to reverse the climate crisis. I wanted really to say it openly in the presence of all of us so that we have the humility to say, these are the leaders, and we all are going to follow, and we'll give a bit of our contribution. And to you all, now I have to thank, because I have to do the thank you. Thanks to you, because it is the best blessing we can have taken from this conference. Thank you to the speakers and moderators who made sure that we will have all the recommendations compiled, for our future action with ACPF. Thank you for your presence, Najat, our sister, where you are and where you are representing us so well. We thank you for having taken the time to spend this year with us. Thank you, my ministers. My ministers, because we listen to commitments, but as you heard me, we want more. Much more. You have the power, you are in positions where we will look, yes, at your countries particularly, to say, take the second lead from this young generation. You will be there at the front line, and you'll be the second line behind them. And all of us, yes, we will give part of our contribution to resolve this crisis. I want to thank also the experts, the committees, which gave here their own statements. I want to thank our host country, Ethiopia, and especially the minister who came and spent not only the morning with us, but she was also with us in the evening. And she gave us really a lot of inputs in terms of what is being done in this country, but more importantly, to host us, all of us here. Civil society organizations across the continent. I think we heard it loud and clear. Activism is still too timid, and perhaps sometimes even too polite. It is important that activists and civil society organizations, they really take the position of leading with an emergency and not with business as usual. I want to thank the ACPF staff. You are stars. You always, organize so well. I'm not talking of logistics. But bringing us together here, the selection of people you brought together for us to think and even to touch us, to understand our responsibilities. We thank you really for this opportunity. I might not have been able to thank everybody, but I want also to thank those who are media and those who have been taking notes of what we have been discussing, even pictures, and to offer, our deliberations to other people who will come after us. We have also the translators who were not seen here, but who allowed us to communicate and to listen to one another. And of course, there are hundreds of people who work behind the scenes. I might not have been able to mention them, but to all and each one of those who made this conference possible, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope next time when we meet, I'll be sitting from somewhere in Southern Africa and watching and to see, yes, it is not us who are going to give the platform to young people. Young people are going to lead, and they will give us the platform to participate. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a bit of housekeeping. There is tea and coffee served, so please you are invited. This is the last tea and coffee. Civil society partners, there is AMC, the Africa-wide Movement for Children, is holding a consultation meeting tomorrow with civil society, with its members, but also with invited guests. It will be held at the Lily Hotel, 10th floor, Mars room. It starts at 9 o'clock. Thank you.
Yaudah, Noni, hari yang sekarang.